Imagine your life is a garden, and every single day you are handed a small handful of seeds. You do not get to choose whether you plant them. You only get to choose which seeds you plant and how much attention you give them once they are in the ground. Most people never think about it this way. They imagine that a great life shows up through one dramatic event, one lucky break, one perfect decision made at exactly the right moment. But that is almost never how it actually works. A great life is built the same way a garden is built, through small, unglamorous, repeated attention, day after day, long before there is anything visible to show for it. Here is the working idea for today. Success is really just a small number of ordinary disciplines, repeated daily, until they compound into something remarkable. And failure, in almost every case, is really just a small number of ordinary neglects, repeated daily until they compound into something painful. The difference between those two outcomes is rarely one giant decision. It is which small things you tend to every day. I want to walk you through 10 specific areas worth tending daily. We will move through them briskly, because the value here is not in lingering on any single one. It is in seeing all 10 together and recognizing which ones you have been quietly neglecting. Before we start, it is worth saying plainly that none of these 10 areas are exotic or complicated. You have almost certainly heard some version of every single one of them before, in some form at some point in your life. The problem was never that this information was hidden from you. The problem is that nobody ever laid all 10 out together and said clearly, these specifically are the ones that quietly decide almost everything else. And here is exactly how to tend to each one daily instead of occasionally. So let's start with the first one, your attention. The first thing worth tending daily is where you actually point your attention, because your attention is the lens through which you experience literally everything else on this list. Here is something worth noticing. Two people can go through the exact same day, the same meetings, the same traffic, the same conversations, and walk away with completely different impressions of it, because one of them was scanning for what went wrong, and the other was scanning for what went right. Neither is lying about their experience. They are both accurately reporting what their attention was trained to notice. I once knew a shop owner named Daniel who ran a small hardware store on a street with declining foot traffic. Every other shop owner on that block talked constantly about how bad things had gotten. Daniel talked about which of his regular customers he could help that week. Same declining street, completely different daily experience, because Daniel had spent years training his attention toward what he could still influence instead of what he could only complain about. 10 years later, his was the only shop left standing on that block. You cannot change your attention overnight, and you do not need to. You improve it the same way you improve anything else, one day at a time. Maybe today you notice one thing that actually went well before you go to sleep. Tomorrow you catch yourself mid-complaint and redirect toward a solution instead. Each small redirection is a brick, and over months those bricks become a genuinely different way of experiencing your own life. There is a specific trap worth naming here. Some people mistake this for pretending everything is fine when it clearly is not, and that is not what this is. Daniel's street genuinely had declining foot traffic. He never denied that. What he refused to do was let that fact consume the entirety of his daily attention, at the expense of noticing the specific, actionable things still within his control. The skill is not blind positivity. It is the discipline of directing attention toward what can still be influenced, even while honestly acknowledging what cannot. A useful daily exercise for building this skill. At the end of each day, before moving on to whatever comes next, name one specific thing within your control that you influenced well today, however small. Not a vague feeling that the day went fine. A specific concrete thing. Over weeks, this simple practice trains your attention to actively search for those moments throughout the day, rather than only noticing them, if at all, in hindsight. Now here is the second area, your words. The words you actually use, both the ones you say to other people, and just as importantly, the ones you say to yourself when no one else is listening. Most people think of communication only as an external skill, something you use in meetings or on dates. But the words running through your own head all day are shaping your actual life just as much, if not more. Someone who narrates their own day with phrases like, "I always mess this up," is quietly training their brain to expect and produce exactly that outcome. Someone who narrates the same events with "that didn't work, let's adjust," is training an entirely different pattern, using the exact same raw material. Externally, the daily discipline is simple to describe and genuinely hard to practice. Say fewer words, and make the words you do say actually land. I worked briefly with a young manager named Priya, who talked constantly in meetings, filling every silence, repeating points 3 different ways out of nervousness that the first version hadn't registered. Once she started deliberately saying less, and trusting silence after an important point instead of rushing to fill it, people in her meetings started actually quoting her back afterward. The words hadn't gotten smarter. The delivery had gotten sharper. This is a daily practice, not a personality trait. Maybe today you notice one piece of harsh self-talk and rephrase it. Tomorrow you practice pausing half a second longer before responding to someone, actually considering what they said instead of just waiting for your turn. Small adjustment by small adjustment, your words, both internal and external, start working for you instead of quietly against you. It is worth noticing how much of daily communication happens automatically, on a kind of autopilot, without much conscious choice involved at all. Most people say the same handful of self-critical phrases so often that they stop even registering them as thoughts. They simply feel like background noise. The daily discipline here starts with simply noticing that background noise for what it is, rather than letting it run entirely unexamined. You cannot redirect a pattern you have never actually noticed running. A simple way to build this awareness: pick a single recurring phrase you tend to use against yourself. Something like, "I'm terrible at this," or "I always ruin things." And simply notice for 1 week, every time it comes up. You do not need to fix it yet. Noticing consistently is the entire first assignment, and it is far more effective than it sounds, because most self-critical language survives specifically by going unnoticed. The third area is your follow-through. Whether you actually finish what you start, and this one is uncomfortable to talk about because almost everyone has a small graveyard of abandoned projects somewhere in their past. Follow-through is not really about willpower, even though it feels that way in the moment. It is closer to a habit of identity. The person who follows through on small commitments to themselves, the 15-minute workout, the single page of writing, the one uncomfortable phone call, is quietly building evidence that they are someone who does what they say. The person who lets small commitments slide is building the opposite evidence, one skipped commitment at a time, whether they notice it happening or not. I knew a young software developer named Marcus who had genuinely brilliant ideas and almost nothing to show for any of them, because he would build the first exciting piece of a project and then abandon it the moment something less exciting needed to happen. A mentor finally told him something simple: pick the smallest possible version of one idea and finish it completely, even if it is unimpressive, before starting anything new. Marcus took that seriously. The first finished thing was small and unremarkable, but finishing it changed something in how he approached the next one and the one after that. Years later, the accumulated finished projects, however modest each one looked individually, had become an actual body of work. You build this daily by picking one small thing each day that you might otherwise abandon and simply finishing it anyway. Not the whole large goal, just today's small piece of it, completed instead of left half done. That single daily habit, repeated for months, is often the entire difference between someone who has ideas and someone who has results. There is a useful distinction worth making here between finishing something and finishing it perfectly. Marcus's early finished projects were genuinely unimpressive by any external standard. That was never the point. The point was building the internal evidence that he was capable of seeing something through to an actual end point, however modest, rather than the more comfortable pattern of abandoning things at the exciting beginning. Perfection was never required. Completion was. It also helps to shrink whatever you are working on until finishing it feels almost too easy to skip. If a project feels too large to finish today, it is almost certainly too large to be today's unit of follow-through. Break it down until the piece in front of you is small enough that not finishing it would feel more effortful than simply finishing it. That is the size of daily follow-through worth practicing. Fourth area. Your beliefs about yourself. The quiet, often unexamined set of beliefs you carry about what you are and are not capable of, because those beliefs function like a ceiling nobody can see, but everyone eventually runs into. Most limiting beliefs were never actually tested. They were absorbed, often from a single offhand comment years ago, a teacher's frustrated remark, a parent's worried warning, a single failed attempt that got generalized into a permanent verdict. I'm just not a numbers person. I've never been good with people. Nobody proved these things with any real rigor. They simply got repeated often enough, internally, that they started functioning as fact. A woman named Teresa once told me she had never been a confident public speaker, and never would be, because she had frozen badly during a school presentation at 14 years old. That was the entire evidence base for a belief she had carried, and reinforced for over 20 years. When she finally examined it honestly, she realized the belief was built on a single data point from a nervous teenager, not on any actual test of her adult capability. She started small, speaking briefly at a handful of low-stakes meetings, and the belief that had felt permanent for 2 decades started dissolving within a few months of small, contrary evidence. You cannot argue yourself out of a limiting belief in one sitting, but you can chip at it daily. Each time you catch yourself thinking, I can't do this, try replacing it, even briefly, with I haven't done this yet. It is a small linguistic shift, but it reopens a door that the original phrasing had quietly closed. It also helps to remember how thin the actual evidence behind most limiting beliefs really is, once you examine it honestly. Teresa's belief had survived 20 years on the strength of a single nervous afternoon as a teenager. Most limiting beliefs, if you trace them back carefully, rest on similarly thin foundations, a handful of early data points, generalized far beyond what they actually proved, and left unexamined simply because revisiting them felt unnecessary or uncomfortable. A useful daily practice for weakening a limiting belief. Each day, look for one small piece of evidence, however modest, that contradicts it. If the belief is I'm not a numbers person, the daily task is not to become a statistician overnight. It is simply to notice one moment where you handled a number, a budget, a calculation, competently enough. Collected daily, these small contradictions eventually outweigh the single old data point the entire belief was quietly built on. Fifth area, your hours. How you actually spend your hours as opposed to how you imagine you spend them, and there is usually a meaningful gap between those two things. Time is unusual among resources because everyone genuinely gets the same amount of it each day, and yet the outcomes people produce from those identical 24 hours vary enormously. The difference is rarely about having more time available. It is almost always about how deliberately that time gets directed toward what actually matters, versus how much of it quietly leaks away into activity that feels busy but produces very little. I worked alongside a consultant named Elena, who used to describe herself as constantly busy and constantly behind, working long hours with little to show for them. When she finally tracked her actual time for 2 weeks, she discovered nearly a third of her working day was consumed by low-value meetings and constant contexts, switching between unrelated small tasks, not by the meaningful client work she thought was eating her schedule. The fix was not working more hours. It was protecting a smaller number of focused blocks and being far more willing to decline the meetings that were not actually necessary. The daily practice here is simple. Before the day begins, decide on the 1 or 2 things that would make the day genuinely worthwhile if nothing else got done, and protect time for those before anything else claims your calendar. Everything else can be negotiated around that protected time. Very few people do this consistently, which is exactly why the people who do tend to look, from the outside, like they somehow have more hours than everyone else. There is a specific reason this practice works so well, despite being so simple. Most days fill themselves with whatever demands attention loudest, not with whatever actually matters most. Without a deliberate decision made in advance, the loudest, most urgent feeling task of the moment tends to win, regardless of its actual importance. Deciding your one or two priorities before the day begins is what allows you to recognize and decline the loud but unimportant demands that would otherwise consume the entire day by default. It is worth adding one further point Elena discovered during her 2-week tracking exercise. A meaningful portion of her lost time came not from any single large block, but from small, repeated interruptions and context switches throughout the day, each individually brief but collectively enormous once totaled up. Protecting a single uninterrupted block of focus time, even a short one, often produces more genuine output than a much longer stretch constantly fragmented by small distractions. Sixth area, your intake, what you feed your mind daily. Because whatever you consistently consume, whether it is genuinely useful or just entertaining noise, becomes the raw material your thinking is built from. The world rewards people who keep learning long after any formal requirement to do so has ended. This does not require an expensive degree or a rigid study schedule. It requires a simple, sustained habit of choosing, at least some of the time, content that actually stretches your understanding, instead of only content that passes the time pleasantly. A retail manager named Oscar once told me he read a single page of a serious, useful book every single night before bed, no matter how tired he was, purely because a single page felt small enough to never skip. A single page a night does not sound impressive. But a single page a night, sustained for several years, quietly became dozens of completed books that most of his peers, who intended to read far more but never built the small daily habit, never actually got through. The compounding here is easy to underestimate because no single day of learning feels transformative. It is the sustained, boring consistency of it that eventually produces someone who simply knows more, thinks more clearly, and makes better decisions than they did a year earlier, almost without noticing the accumulation happening in real time. It is worth distinguishing here between consuming content passively and actually learning from it. Scrolling through hours of content about a subject every day without ever testing any of it against real decisions or real conversations produces a feeling of progress that rarely translates into genuine capability. The people who actually grow from their daily intake are the ones who occasionally pause to ask what they would actually do differently based on what they just learned, rather than simply moving on to the next piece of content immediately afterward. A simple daily filter worth applying. Before consuming something, ask briefly whether it is likely to stretch your thinking or simply occupy your attention. Both have a place in a balanced day, but most people never consciously distinguish between the two and end up spending nearly all of their available time on the second category by default, then wondering why an entire year of daily consumption produced so little visible growth. Seventh area, your money habits, your relationship with money, and this is one where daily neglect is especially easy, because the consequences of a single day's financial decision are almost always invisible in the moment. Most financial trouble is not caused by dramatic mistakes. It is caused by a long accumulation of small, unexamined decisions, none of which felt significant on their own. A coffee here, a subscription there, a slightly larger purchase justified by a slightly rough week. None of it feels reckless in isolation. All of it adds up quietly into a financial picture that eventually surprises the very person who created it, one small decision at a time. A young couple I knew, Ravi and Sana, spent years describing themselves as bad with money, despite both having steady, reasonable incomes. The actual problem was never their income. It was that neither of them had ever looked closely enough at where the money actually went to make any deliberate decisions about it. Once they began simply tracking every expense for a single month, without changing anything yet, the picture became so clear that the necessary adjustments practically made themselves. Awareness alone solved most of the problem before any real sacrifice was required. The daily discipline is not complicated. Know where your money went today. Make one deliberate decision, however small, that favors your future self over your present impulse. None of this requires financial expertise. It requires the same quality this entire list keeps returning to: consistent, unglamorous attention applied daily instead of occasionally. It is worth noting how much relief tends to follow simply from knowing, clearly, where things actually stand financially, even before any major changes have been made. Ravi and Sana described a real reduction in anxiety within the very first week of tracking their spending, long before their finances had meaningfully improved in any measurable way. Uncertainty, it turns out, is often more stressful than the actual numbers, whatever those numbers happen to be. Daily attention replaces vague dread with specific, workable facts. One further daily habit worth adopting alongside tracking: before any non-essential purchase, pause for a few seconds and ask whether this specific purchase moves you toward or away from what you actually want financially. Not a lengthy internal debate, just a brief, honest check. That few seconds of daily friction, repeated consistently, tends to prevent a surprising number of the small, unexamined purchases that otherwise accumulate into exactly the kind of financial surprise most people eventually experience. Eighth area: your skills. The deliberate sharpening of whatever skill actually matters most to your goals right now, because general effort spread thin across everything tends to produce mediocrity everywhere, while focused daily effort on one specific skill tends to produce real competence relatively quickly. There is a difference between staying busy in your field and actually getting sharper at the specific thing that would move you forward. A graphic designer named Wen spent years feeling stuck at the same skill level, despite working full days, because her daily work consisted almost entirely of applying skills she already had, rather than deliberately practicing the specific technique she was actually weak in. Once she carved out even 20 minutes a day dedicated purely to the one skill she knew was holding her back, her actual capability jumped in a matter of months, far faster than the previous several years of simply staying busy had produced. The daily practice here is narrow and specific. Identify the one skill that would matter most if you improved it, and give it deliberate, focused attention today, separate from your regular workload. Not vague effort, a specific chosen weak point worked on directly, a little each day. This distinction between staying busy and deliberately practicing matters more than it first appears. Wen had been working full, exhausting days for years without meaningfully improving, precisely because full days spent applying existing skills do not automatically produce new capability. Genuine improvement requires specifically targeting the edge of current ability, which is uncomfortable and slower feeling in the moment, but is the only thing that actually moves the skill itself forward rather than simply repeating what is already comfortable. A useful daily question for identifying that edge: what specifically in your work today did you find slightly uncomfortable or slightly outside your current comfort zone? That discomfort, tracked and pursued deliberately rather than avoided, tends to point directly at the skill worth developing next, far more reliably than any generic advice to simply work harder or longer. Ninth area: your direction. Your sense of direction, the reason underneath your daily effort, because effort without a clear direction eventually produces exhaustion rather than satisfaction, no matter how hard someone works. I once met a man named Franklin who had built a genuinely successful business by every external measure and yet described himself as quietly miserable most days. When I asked him directly why he was building any of it, he sat with the question for a long time before admitting he genuinely did not know anymore. Somewhere along the way, the original reason had faded, and he had simply kept moving because stopping felt more frightening than continuing without a clear why. Bacterant, unlike a single decision, is not something you settle once and then forget. It needs daily, small reconnection. Maybe today you spend 2 minutes reminding yourself specifically why the work in front of you matters to you, beyond the immediate task. Tomorrow you make one small choice that actually reflects what you say matters to you, rather than simply what is convenient. Direction tended daily even briefly, tends to stay clear. Neglected, even by someone highly capable, it quietly fades, and the fading is rarely noticed until the emptiness Franklin described has already set in. What made Franklin's situation particularly striking was how competent he remained throughout the entire drift. He kept making sound business decisions, kept growing the company, kept impressing everyone around him, all while the underlying sense of why had quietly gone missing. Competence and direction are not the same thing, and it is entirely possible to keep performing well by every external measure while the internal compass has stopped functioning. That gap is exactly why this particular area needs daily, deliberate tending rather than being left to maintain itself in the background of a busy, successful-looking life. A simple daily check worth adopting. At some point each day, ask yourself plainly whether today's effort actually connected to something that matters to you, or whether it was simply motion, however productive-looking, disconnected from any real why. You do not need a fully resolved life purpose to answer this honestly. You only need enough daily attention to notice when the connection has quietly gone missing before the gap grows as large as the one Franklin eventually had to confront all at once. And here is the 10th and final area: your appreciation. Deliberately noticing what is already good, because this is the one most easily crowded out by the pressure of everything else on this list. A woman named Clara went through a genuinely difficult stretch, losing both a job and a long relationship within the same few months. On the advice of a friend, she started writing down one specific thing she was grateful for each night, no matter how small, even on the worst days. She later described this practice not as denial of how hard things were, but as the one habit that kept her able to notice, even in a difficult season, that not everything in her life had collapsed at once. That noticing, however small, was what gave her enough footing to slowly rebuild the rest. This daily practice costs nothing and takes under a minute. And it is astonishing how consistently people skip it anyway, as though appreciation is a luxury reserved for once things are already going well, rather than one of the very things that helps things go well in the first place. Maybe tonight you name one specific small thing that went right today. Tomorrow night, a different one. Over time, this daily habit quietly shifts your baseline experience of your own life, from noticing mostly what is missing to noticing, at least some of the time, what is already there. It is worth being precise about what this practice is not. It is not forced positivity, and it is not a substitute for actually addressing real problems where they exist. Clara did not pretend the job loss or the breakup were fine. She simply refused to let those two real losses become the entirety of her daily experience, and the small nightly practice of naming something specific and true, however modest, was what kept a sliver of perspective available to her, even during the hardest stretch of that year. A closing note on this particular daily practice: the specificity matters more than people expect. A vague nightly thought of, "I guess things are okay," does very little. A specific one, "Today my neighbor helped me carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs without being asked," does considerably more, because specificity forces genuine attention rather than a passing, forgettable gesture toward positivity. So let's bring all 10 of these together. None of these 10 areas require a dramatic overhaul, and trying to fix all 10 simultaneously tends to produce exactly nothing, because it is simply too much to sustain at once. Instead, pick the one area from this list that you already suspect, if you are honest with yourself, is the one most quietly holding your life back right now. Give that one area small, genuine daily attention for the next 30 days before adding a second. 10 small disciplines, tended consistently over a long enough stretch of time, produce a life that looks from the outside remarkably different from where it started, even though no single day along the way ever felt dramatic. It is worth noticing that these 10 areas are not entirely independent of each other. Improving your attention tends to improve your appreciation, because both involve deliberately directing focus rather than letting it wander by default. Improving your follow-through tends to improve your finances and your skills, because all three depend on the same underlying willingness to do the unglamorous thing consistently rather than the exciting thing occasionally. You do not need to master all 10 in isolation. Genuine progress in any one of them tends to make several of the others slightly easier as well, which is part of why starting with just one, chosen deliberately, tends to work better than attempting all 10 scattered thinly across a single week. There is also a useful way to think about the order you tackle these in, if you want one. Areas like your attention, your beliefs, and your appreciation are largely internal, requiring no external resources or permission from anyone else, which makes them a reasonable place to start if you are looking for immediate traction. Areas like your money habits and your skills often benefit from the internal shifts happening first, since a clearer, less reactive mind tends to make better decisions in both of those more externally visible areas. There is no single correct order that works for everyone, but starting with whichever area feels most immediately actionable to you right now tends to work better than waiting for the theoretically perfect starting point. So here is the entire idea, stripped down to its simplest form. Success is a small number of ordinary disciplines, practiced daily, that eventually compound into something remarkable. Failure is a small number of ordinary neglects, repeated daily, that eventually compound into something painful. Both outcomes are built the exact same way, one unremarkable day at a time. You do not need a perfect plan for all 10 areas today. You need one small, genuine improvement in one area, starting with whatever is left of today. That is where every version of the life you actually want quietly begins. If you take nothing else from the last 35 minutes, take this. The gap between the life you currently have and the life you actually want is almost never as large as it feels from the inside. It is not measured in giant leaps or lucky breaks. It is measured in a small number of ordinary days, tended consistently that most people simply never bother to tend at all. You now know exactly which 10 areas those are. What you do with today is, as it always has been, entirely up to you.